Good evening. Welcome to our second Wednesday program for Norfolk Historical Society. I am Peggy McPhillips. I'm president of Norfolk Historical Society, and it is my very great pleasure to introduce to you all this evening's speaker, Andrew Lawler. Andrew is a native of Norfolk, going to the Outer Banks during the summer and going to the Lost Colony, the pageant that they had down there. Little did he know how that would stick in his mind and in his life. A couple of years ago, 2018, he published a book called About the Lost Colony. And he's going to talk to us about that tonight. Andrew is a journalist. He has written and edited articles in Smithsonian, Science, Archaeology, New York Times. He wrote another book called Why Did the Chicken Cross the World? And in November, his third book will come out called Under Jerusalem, which goes into depth about the archaeological surveys underneath the city of Jerusalem, all of the discoveries that have been made there, and its ties into so many cultures in the world. I can't wait to get my copy. But tonight, let me ask you, did you all ever wonder you've heard of the Lost Colony, did you ever wonder who lost it? Andrew's going to talk to us a little bit about that tonight, and hopefully answer the question, I don't know. You will notice at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat function and a Q&A function. You are invited all throughout the program to type in questions and ask them through the chat function as well. And I will collect them, and at the end, we will put them to Andrew and see what he has to tell us. But for right now, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you all Andrew Lawler. Andrew?
Thank you very much, Peggy, and thanks to Breck as well, who is handling the technical aspects of our Zoom lecture tonight. Peggy was kind enough to ask me to talk about my book, The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke. As she mentioned, it was published in 2018 and the paperback 2019. And it's really wonderful to be able to talk to the Norfolk Historical Society because, of course, I was raised in Norfolk and in Edgewater and went to school at Norfolk Academy and left when I was 18, but I continue to go back. My mother still lives there, and I'm happy to have this chance to talk to you all. So let's get started. I'm going to do a little PowerPoint presentation with some good images. So you're going to see that come up in just a moment. All right, great. So if you're with me, you're looking at a slide, Who Lost the Lost Colony? And this is a really lovely photograph that was taken by a National Geographic photographer, Mark Thiessen. I did an article for the magazine about the Lost Colony, the search for the Lost Colony. And if you notice there at the bottom right, you'll see a ship. That's the Elizabeth II, not the big ocean liner that occasionally comes into Norfolk, but in fact, the reproduction of one of the ships that brought one set of colonists over to Roanoke Island in North Carolina. And I was actually on that ship when Mark took that photograph from a helicopter. And you see that lovely sunset. Well, that's actually a giant storm, a November storm that's coming toward us. And I spent a couple of days on that boat. We were sailing from Manteo on Roanoke Island to Bath, North Carolina. And I got a small but very vivid taste of what it's like to be in a small wooden ship during a very bad storm. And this was only in the Sound. It wasn't even in the ocean. So it's a nice reminder that in days of air travel, that this transit across the ocean was extremely hazardous at best and deadly at worst. And it was also boring, and it was also exciting in more ways than people would imagine today. So that's just a little background to how the colonists actually made it over to the coast of North Carolina. So let's move. Okay, hold on a sec. There we go. So one of the questions that I get asked by editors as a journalist all the time is, when I pitch a story, is why does it matter? And the reason the Lost Colony is so important for American history is that it was the first attempt by the English to both study and settle the New World. Until this point, England really had no idea what was going on in the New World, where the Spanish and others, like the French, had been colonizing for more than a century. So at this point in the 1580s, when this colonization ever took place, 115 men, women, and children were abandoned. They were lost. And so for 4 centuries, we have had very few clues as to what took place on Roanoke Island back in the 1580s. But another piece that people may not be familiar with that I was really fascinated to discover was that Roanoke, the colonization of Roanoke, created a model for the way the English interacted with Native Americans. Now, why does that matter? Well, it kind of set the tone for what was going to happen in the centuries to come. So what happened on Roanoke is actually very relevant to what's happening today in relations between European Americans and Native Americans. So I think that's something that kind of gets lost in the fascination with the mystery, which, while fascinating, has, I think, deeper and more important aspects. All right, so this may come as a surprise to some people, but the first real global empire was not the British Empire. You've heard the phrase that the sun never set on the British Empire. Well, that's true, but long before that, the Spanish had an empire, and the sun never set on that. That was actually the first truly global empire. So in the 1580s, Spain took over Portugal's empire. And the combination of these two empires merging together made for this political and economic dynamo. So the Spanish controlled at that point everything, including large chunks of the Americas, as well as parts of Africa, of course, parts of Europe, and not just Spain, but also chunks of Italy, bits of Belgium, bits of what we call the Netherlands now. So it was a very fascinating and very diverse empire that stretched all the way to the Philippines. And the Philippines were important because the Philippines were the place where the Spanish traders could go to trade with China. So let's talk about the scene of the crime, as it were. And it's, for people in Norfolk, of course, you all heard of the Gulf Stream, so I don't have to go into too much detail, but there was a conveyor belt that Europeans discovered, and this is what powered the colonization efforts in the 16th and 17th centuries. Without this current, it would have been we would have had an extremely different history. So essentially, you could ride the current into the Caribbean. From England, you can move down coast of Africa and then zoom over to the Caribbean and then slip into the Gulf Stream, which moved up the coast right to the Outer Banks. And if you look to the right, you will see a map that was drawn by John White, a character we'll come back to shortly, who painted the coast of North Carolina with remarkable accuracy. And if you look at this map, if you look at the top left, you see kind of a coat of arms. It's upside down. Look a little bit to the left of that, and you'll see Skikowak, which was the Indian village, which is located, we believe was located somewhere in the Norfolk area, maybe where downtown is, maybe somewhere along the Elizabeth River, probably. But that is a village still not been discovered by archaeologists, but we know that the colonists went up and visited this area, the area of Norfolk, back during the colonization effort. And if you move down the coast, you'll see the Outer Banks that are familiar to most of you, I assume, who have been to Roanoke Island, or at least to Nag's Head and Hatteras. And that little island at the bottom right that's in red, that is what we call Hatteras Island, which at that point there was an inlet between, right where the lighthouse is today, there was an inlet nearby that separated, there were two islands. And the top one was called Hatteras, and the bottom one was the site of several villages. I'm sorry, I'm wrong about that. The top one was basically connected to the main part of the Outer Banks, and the bottom one was Hatteras. That red line, the red outline there, is of what's also called Croatan. And we'll come back to that term, which you may be familiar with. And just south of that is Ocracoke Island, and beyond that, Cape Lookout, etc. So this gives you a feel for where the Gulf Stream was. It was moving just offshore and right off Cape Hatteras, it was moving off and then going back to England. So if you were a ship, whether you were a Spanish ship or a French ship or an English ship, and you were moving out of the Caribbean, you wanted to get in the Gulf Stream and slide by. And the Gulf Stream came close to shore right there on the Outer Banks. It was a very, very important place. It was almost like sitting on the side of I-95 today. It was a very important highway that transported not just English colonists, but more importantly, Spanish galleons. They were bringing goods all the way from the Philippines, transshipping them across Panama, and then bringing them up through the Caribbean, past the Outer Banks. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the people. We've talked some about the geography and the lay of the land, as it were. And now we can hone in on who the main actors are in this Lost Colony drama. And you'll be familiar with many of these people, but I'll go through them. The top middle there, you'll see, of course, Queen Elizabeth I. She was called the Virgin Queen, and that's where we get our term Virginia, because the guy in the middle, Sir Walter Raleigh, was very clever at branding, and he told the Queen that he wanted to name this new world that he discovered Virginia in her name. And Raleigh was an interesting character. He was not a very wealthy aristocrat, and he wasn't even very much of an aristocrat. Came from a small family in Devon, and he rose through the ranks because he was good looking, he was funny, and he was very smart. And the combination, of course, drew the attention of the Queen, and she considered him one of her favorites. He was quite a bit younger than her at that point, very dashing. He was good at coming up with poetry on the spur of the moment, and was also interested in science. He was interested in the new advances that were moving through Europe in this era just before the Enlightenment begins to take shape. Now, the person at the bottom right, you may not know who that is. That's Thomas Harriot. Thomas Harriot was a key figure. He was probably England's first scientist, first true scientist, and one of the first great European thinkers. He decided that when he graduated from college, that he needed to do something interesting, and Raleigh roped him in to the Roanoke Ventures, and he played a very essential role in those ventures, and we'll mention him later. Now, on the right and the left, you'll see some of our Native American players. Now, these were people, we don't actually know the name of their tribe, maybe CROATAN. It's kind of controversial because the English didn't really understand who they were meeting and what tribes they were and how they were related. So our information is a little sparse. But what we do know is that these were Algonquin-speaking people. They spoke a dialect of Algonquin, which was a cultural group that stretched all the way from the Outer Banks up through Virginia along the coast, all the way to Canada. And these people were hunter-gatherers as well as farmers, so they were fishing. They were also planting corn, and they had lived on the Outer Banks for generations, maybe 1,000 years or so, hard to say, but probably at least that long, and certainly other peoples had been there even before them. Now, what I love about these two images is that, number one, well, they were painted by John White, who was the artist and later the governor of the Lost Colony, but also that the irony is that we have these beautiful portraits of Native Americans who were there on Roanoke Island, but we have no portraits of any of the lost colonists, including Thomas Harriot, because he wasn't actually part of the Lost Colony. He came on a previous expedition, and this portrait was actually made maybe 30 years after he spent time as a young 20-something on Roanoke. So the irony is that we have these images, and we know who these people probably are. The one on the left is probably Wingina, and Wingina was the primary chief, the leader of this fairly large group that lived at Roanoke Island and eastern North Carolina, stretching down the coast a bit. And on the right is probably his wife and child. And what's so compelling about the image on the right, this beautiful watercolor that John White did, is that she's holding the traditional gourd, she's got her traditional beads, and you can see the tattoos, but next to her is probably her daughter, who's holding this English doll, who's completely dressed and is a clear sign of the first interaction between these two cultures. So I think it's a very poignant moment when clearly John White probably gave her the doll in order for her to stand still long enough that he could do a quick sketch. So these are real treasures that exist now in the British Museum. And if you're ever there, you can actually make an appointment to go see the originals of these drawings, of these paintings, which I highly recommend. It's a great experience, and I talk about that a bit in the book. Okay. All right, so we're going to do a very, very quick rundown of the voyages. Now, I know a lot of you may know about this, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly and just run through the fact that the Lost Colony was not the only colony. So the Roanoke Voyages began in 1584 when Sir Walter Raleigh, who we mentioned before, decided that it was time for England to try and catch up with Spain. Spain had been for nearly a century colonizing the New World, bringing back its riches, and England, by contrast, was actually a relatively poor place and was certainly not an empire. They could barely hold on to Ireland, which was the only foreign possession that they had. They lost their possessions on the continent by that point. So Raleigh had this vision of England trying to catch up with Spain. So how do you do that? Well, you want to set up a colony, right? You want to send people over and settle and find out who's there, find the gold, find the silver, and bring it back to England. Well, in 1584, a scouting mission was sent with 2 fairly small ships with a Portuguese pilot named Simão Fernandes in Portuguese, or Simon Fernando in Spanish, because he had worked with the Spanish, for the Spanish, and knew how to get to and from the New World. I mean, it's astounding. I was astounded to discover that no English pilot at that point was competent enough to carry people across the ocean and then back again. So they had to hire foreigners, and Fernandez actually had lived in Wales and then England for some time, and he was a bit of a pirate, but hey, he knew the waters, so they hired him. The ships arrive, they meet with the Native Americans, with Wingina and the tribe, with other tribes, including the Croatans, who live a little to the south, and they decide, hey, it's a great place, people are very friendly, they do a little touring around, they eat the seafood, it's summertime, they have a great time. It's very much like what tourists do today. So after a couple of months, they got on their ships and sailed back to England, came back to England in the fall. And they said to Raleigh, this is the place we want to be. Now, one of the questions is, why here? If you've ever been to the Outer Banks, you know it is extremely treacherous. There's a reason why it's called the graveyard of the Atlantic. And you'll see the ships in this image that are obviously have hit the sandbanks and sank. So it's a very dangerous area. There's not a big harbor. It's not like Norfolk. Norfolk would have been the obvious place because that's where you could bring in deep water ships, be much, much safer. But what the English wanted in the beginning was not to create a nice colony with people farming. They wanted to attack Spanish shipping. That's where you made your money. They wanted to essentially be pirates. So they wanted to create a pirate base that was on the coast near the Gulf Stream. Norfolk is a little too far north and a little bit too far west. They wanted to be right there where they could nip out, take a Spanish ship, take it back to England, and then build a big house and live in great luxury. That was the get-rich-quick scheme that Raleigh and a lot of his investors envisioned. But in 1585, they decided to send a large enough complement to really make a town, if you will, to make this pirate base sustainable. And they settled on Roanoke Island, which you can see there in the middle of that island, a little bit to the left in the middle. And we don't actually know where they settled because that site has yet to be found by archaeologists. But we do know there's an Indian village nearby, that we can see it on this map. And about 100 or so people landed and began to build the city of Raleigh. And this town was actually a pirate base, but also a base for scientific operations. Because Thomas Harriot, the man I mentioned earlier, the scientist, he and a Jewish German metallurgist set up a workshop, and they traveled around the area looking for ore. They wanted to find gold or silver, or at least find copper in large amounts that they could ship back to England. So they set up what was really extraordinary and fairly sophisticated laboratory there on Roanoke Island in 1585. Now, what's amazing is that this is the only piece of the lost colony of the Roanoke Voyages that has been found, the only physical evidence we have of, at this point that's undisputed, of the Roanoke Voyages is what remains of this workshop that Joachim Gans and Thomas Harriot created there in 1585. But a hurricane came up, they began to starve. The Indians no longer were very friendly because the English were incompetent and kept asking for more food, and the Native Americans did not have vast supplies to sell. So eventually the relationship soured, the weather was bad, winter came, it was a pretty terrible time, and it looked like the English were not going to make it. And then they made what was a really critical mistake. In an effort to try and get food and to show the Native Americans who was boss, they crossed over the water from Roanoke Island and attacked the village of Wingina, killed Wingina, as well as many of his people, in a surprise morning raid. And this was a really bad move because not only did they kill the chief, they completely alienated all of the Native Americans in the region, who now saw the English as enemies. I don't know about you, but I was certainly taught that you don't kill your hosts. It's not a good idea. And that's exactly what the English did. They were fortunate in that days after this terrible incident, Sir Francis Drake arrived from the Caribbean. And he showed up and said, "What's up, guys? Do you need help?" And they said, "Yes, take us back to England." So they piled on his ships, went back to England, and that should have been the end of the English colonization efforts at Roanoke. Except our friend Thomas Harriot and John White, who had been the artist on that expedition, they got together and they convinced Raleigh to try one more time. This time, they were going to set up a real colony, bring in women as well as children, bring in people who were skilled at farming, and try and set up a sustainable kind of town. So in other words, not a pirate base, not a group of people trying to get gold or silver, but rather people who wanted to stay and trade with the Indians because they were a new market. The market of the Native Americans, you had a whole continent of naked people, and the English had a lot of cloth to sell. So it seemed like a good idea. Raleigh managed to pull together the money, or actually John White found friends and investors. They got enough money, and in 1587, the ship set sail with 115 men, women, and children, including John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare. And Eleanor Dare at that point was pregnant. She gave birth just days after they arrived on Roanoke Island. And in a nod to Raleigh and to the Queen, they named their daughter Virginia. She was Virginia Dare, a name I'm sure you're familiar with. And days after that, John White decided to go back. John White is the governor of the colony at this point. He goes back to England to try and get supplies because they are desperate to get more food and also to bring more settlers to create enough of a population to sustain themselves. He has a terrible time getting home. There's storms. He's almost wrecked on the coast of Ireland. It takes him months and months to get back. It's almost the end of the year before he arrives back in London. And his timing, as always with John White, is terrible. Why? Well, just as he arrives in London, news reaches the Queen's palace. The Spanish are building an armada and they intend to attack England and invade England, unseat the Queen, and get rid of these nasty Protestants and put a proper Catholic queen on the throne, or a king. So this was an incredible national security threat. So Queen Elizabeth naturally said, all right, at this point, no ship is leaving England. We can't afford to let anybody leave. We need all of our ships here to defend the homeland. John White, of course, was, well, what can you say? I mean, what would your emotions be if you realize that your daughter and granddaughter are on a distant island that you can't get back to, that they're essentially marooned? So he spent 3 years trying to gather the resources and get the attention of officials to be able to return with the supplies and additional settlers he had promised. But it's not until 1590 that he succeeds. And even then, he basically is a stowaway on a ship that goes to the Caribbean and manages to convince the captain, when they're moving through the Gulf Stream past the Outer Banks to stop in to check on the settlers. And when he gets there, well, what does he find? Nothing. The village is there. There's remains of the town, but it's been taken down. There's no sign, though, of struggle. There's no sign of warfare. There are no bodies. There's no graves. It looks like there's been a very orderly retreat. But where did they go? And we'll answer that question in a moment. So when John White is there on Roanoke Island, he finds one important clue. He finds a tree that's carved with the word CROATAN. Remember, I mentioned that earlier. That is the old name essentially for Hatteras. And this was, as John White said, the secret token that he had told the colonists to leave. In other words, if you go anywhere while I'm gone, leave a note. And this was their note. We're going to CROATAN. We're going 50 miles south, what's now Hatteras Island, to stay with presumably the Croatan Indians, including Manteo, who was one of the Indians who had traveled back twice to England and was fluent in English, had been made a lord by Queen Elizabeth, and clearly was an important figure who's been largely ignored by historians. So that seemed obvious. So John White sails the next day for Hatteras. It's only 50 miles away. Of course, it's John White. He gets caught in a storm. He can't get there. He has to sail off. And the captain says, look, it's too late in the season. It's hurricane season. We got to get out of here. So John White ends up back in England. And that's the last we hear of John White. We don't know what happens to him. We don't know when he died. And we don't know what he went through, the agony of every day imagining what was happening to his daughter and granddaughter on Roanoke Island. But there's another clue. John White says in his description of the colony when he was back in England, he says, they were also planning to go 50 miles into the Main. What does that mean? Well, 50 miles presumably inland, that is to the west, up Albemarle Sound. So that's a clue, but he never had a chance to check it out. There are also Spanish sources. The Spanish actually arrived very close to Roanoke Island a year or two before John White went on his search mission. They actually found bits and pieces of a little port there that the colonists used, but they didn't take the time to go to Roanoke Island. And that's one of the great what ifs. If only that captain had gone to check out Roanoke Island, he might have discovered what happened to them. But he also likely would have killed him because the Spanish viewed these colonists as a nest of pirates. Now, there's also stories that came out of Jamestown. There's one theory that they were all killed by Powhatan, and there's even a more specific theory called the Norfolk, basically the Norfolk theory, and that is that they came up to the Norfolk area and settled, and then in 1607, just before the English arrive at Jamestown, Powhatan murders all of the tribe, the Chesapeakeans who lived in the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area because they weren't paying their taxes. And as a result, by the time the Jamestown colonists arrived, there are no more lost colonists. So these were the only theories really and real clues that we have as to what happened to these people. And that's where I started my search. And this is one of the best stories of the past 4 centuries when it comes to lost colony. In 2012, a UNC professor asked the dumb question. You see the map on the right, and if you notice at the center, at the left, you'll see like a little patch, right? The Albemarle Sound breaks off into this wishbone. And right there, you'll see a patch. So he said, what's under the patch? Finally, the British Museum agreed to put it on a light table. And when they did, lo and behold, if you look to the left, by the magnifying glass, there's an image of a fort under this patch. Where is this located? This is 50 miles into the Main, 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island. A pretty interesting clue that perhaps the colonists did, as John White said, and moved inland and built a fort. Now, John White drew this map before the lost colonists had even arrived. So we don't really know what it means, except that it's a place of interest, right? It's a place that the English may have built a fort in the 1585 expedition, or they intended to build a fort. But what's even more interesting is that on top of this patch, in invisible ink, is another fort that's drawn. And it's actually drawn in urine because that was an invisible ink. Put a little orange juice on it and it turns into something visible. So that was a little Elizabethan trick to be able to hide your correspondence. So it sounds like John White was trying to hide something. He was trying to hide this fort. It wasn't just a patch to cover it up. Oh, it's a real estate project that didn't get done. So this was a mystery, but it gave archaeologists a place to look for the first time. And so they began to dig. A group called the First Colony Foundation started to dig in Bertie County, North Carolina. There, if you look on the map at the bottom right, you'll see that area just that's sticking out into the sound. That was the place where it looked like the fort was. You can see at the top left. So they began to dig in that area, and lo and behold, they found some Indian pottery. They found signs of a Native American settlement that likely dated to that period. This was really exciting. And it got even better because what they found next, well, little bits of pottery, so what, right? Well, these might be the lost pots of the lost colonists. These are bits of a pot that was made in England. So what is a pot that was made in England doing in a Native American settlement that dates possibly to the 16th century? Well, the answer is we don't know for sure if this is pottery that was made by the lost colonists or brought over by the lost colonists, or if it's pottery that maybe came in a little bit later when the Jamestown settlers settled 20 years later. Maybe there were some pots that were traded south or a trader came. There's a lot of controversy about these little bits of pottery. You know, are these truly Elizabethan pots or were they made a little bit later? And the experts are still fighting over this, and we're waiting for final publication of this really fascinating dig at Site X in order to find out whether, in fact, at least some of the colonists went 50 miles inland and settled with the Native Americans. Now, as a journalist, it was red meat to me when I discovered that there were two teams that were looking for physical evidence of what happened to the colonists. The first at Site X, the second on Croatan. Nobody had ever thought to really dig on Croatan to look for evidence of Europeans in the 16th century. So a British team that was supported by a local organization, the Croatan Archaeological Society, they raised money, brought the British team over to do some really excellent archaeology at the site of a Native American village. You can see the little point there on the right. That's very close to where the lighthouse is, and it's also close to where there was a village near on the left. You can see where that inlet is. So they began to dig there, and what did they find? Well, they found some amazing stuff. They found swords, they found glass, they found lead shot, they found an amazing array of artifacts. But like Site X, the question is, are these artifacts that belong to the lost colonists who then moved in with Native Americans, or are they objects that were traded later from Jamestown and eventually made their way to Roanoke Island? I'm sorry, to Hatteras. And this is a question that is still controversial, just like the pots at Site X. And again, we're waiting to hear what the detailed analysis has to say. So the clues point to the early English living with Native Americans. That seems clear, both at Site X and at Hatteras. It's clear that you find these artifacts in a Native American context, in a Native American village. Okay, so they joined up with the Native Americans. What's the mystery? If you're hungry, your neighbor has a full refrigerator, you're going to knock on their door and say, hey, can I have a sandwich? And I'll cut your lawn. So clearly, it makes total sense that the lost colonists didn't simply vanish into thin air. There were no aliens involved and no vampires, despite what you might see online. In fact, it seems obvious they moved in with the Native Americans, who knew how to live and survive in that environment very well, had been doing so for generations. So I got interested. It's like, well, if it's so obvious, why is there a mystery? And then I discovered what I think of as colonial America's dirty little secret. And what this is that it's only in the past few decades that historians have discovered that large numbers of white people, of Europeans, people of European descent, whether English or French or Spanish, they often deserted from wherever they were colonizing, and moved in with the Native Americans. Now, some did not go of their own accord. Some were taken by force and forced to live in Native American society. But even those people, after a matter of a couple of years, even 2 or 3 years, they often prefer to stay with the Native Americans rather than go back to live with their European friends. Even if they left behind children and parents and family, they often decided that life was better. The Native American life was preferable. And this is pretty extraordinary. I was kind of shocked to see the extent of literature all the way into the 19th century about European Americans who decided to go native. There was hunger, harsh discipline, and war as well that drove these later colonists into the arms of Native Americans. So that I thought was interesting. Nobody really talked about that in the literature that I saw. And then I asked this obvious question. Who first used the term lost colony? Who first said it was a lost colony? Well, the truth is that for the first couple of centuries, nobody cared. Nobody really gave it much thought after Jamestown. And well, they died, they moved in with Native Americans. We don't really know, and they're dead. It wasn't an important question. But in the 1830s, suddenly the lost colony is coined. The term is coined, and it becomes a source of great fascination to people all over the country. And I thought, what happened in the 1830s? Well, there are a few important things happening. There was, first of all, Nat Turner's rebellion, not too far to the west of Norfolk in Southampton County. And there was also the Trail of Tears, when Native Americans, not just Cherokee, but Choctaw and Chickasaw and others, were being forced off their land and forced west of the Mississippi so that the white settlers could grow primarily cotton. So this was also a period when Andrew Jackson was president. And take this with a grain of salt, I just thought it was kind of cute, but Andrew Jackson was, much as our last president was, a very divisive leader. And you either loved him or you hated him. And he was very uncompromising in his views. He wanted the Native Americans gone, and he was terrified of slave rebellions. So he really helped to shape or to reflect the fears in white society at the time that there were going to be slave insurrections and that the Indians had to be moved out of the way in order for the country to grow economically. And this was happening at the moment that the lost colony comes into being as an idea. And then there was Virginia Dare. So let's talk about Virginia Dare. As you know, she was born on Roanoke Island. She was the child of Eleanor Dare, and Ananias Dare was her father. But that's all we know. She was born, she was baptized, and John White left. The historical record ends. So she is the American, the most famous American, you could say, about whom we know so little. And she became this mythical figure in the 19th century, kind of like Pocahontas, but a white version of Pocahontas. There were statues made to her. You can see in the far left, that's now on the Elizabethan Gardens, which I highly recommend you visit next time you're on Roanoke Island. She became a wine seller. She was used in advertising to sell wine made from Scuppernong grapes, which I do not recommend. And she became this kind of cult figure of femininity. She was always portrayed as blue-eyed and blonde, and was considered the first white child born in America. Today we say the first English child, but in the 19th century, people who were of Spanish or Italian or Jewish descent were not considered white at all. They were colored, people of color. So Virginia Dare was thought of as the first white child. I thought, this is fascinating. And I just kept following this rabbit hole to see where it would take me. And it took me to a very interesting place. It took me to Roanoke Island's celebrations of Virginia Dare's birthday in the early 1900s. Every year they'd have a big party in August. And this is an example of just one of many quotes that I saw from speeches that were given at this gathering. The descendants of these first Christian inhabitants of our land are not to be sought in the mongrel remnants, part Indian, part white, and part Negro, of a decaying tribe of American savages. Now, this is not some crazy early 20th century white supremacists. This is the Episcopal Bishop of North Carolina. So this is a sample of how people viewed Virginia Dare. And then it started to fall into place for me. I realized Virginia Dare became a symbol of the fears among whites of African Americans in the South. This is the time of Jim Crow, when the rights of African Americans are being severely constrained. And also a time when 1 million people a year are flooding into the North, people from all over Europe as well as Asia. And this was terrifying to many whites who felt like, many people of English heritage in particular, they felt like the country was being overrun, that the original settlers were being diluted, that this was going to be the death of American civilization. So this is the context in which the Lost Colony gets lost, because the idea that they became Native American, which was assumed in the 16th and 17th centuries, suddenly becomes something you can't even talk about. Why? It was illegal then for a white person to marry a Native American, much less an African American. So if you think this is just kind of interesting history, so what? Then to my fascination, I discovered that Virginia Dare is alive and well. That this website, vdare.com, which is run by a white supremacist, or a white nationalist, I guess is the term that he likes to use. He's a British citizen who moved to America and became an American citizen. And he believes that there are too many people of color in this country, and we should restrict immigration to keep more Europeans, Northern Europeans in particular, at the forefront of the population growth. And he has all kinds of articles that you can read that talk about this fear of immigration. And I started to realize that what began in the 19th century is still going on in the 21st century, which is, to me, a fascinating story of how the Lost Colony became a mirror of our fears about both African Americans, the fear of whites of African Americans, as well as of immigration, which are, of course, extremely hot topics these days. And then I started to poke around in the literature and discovered that, well, in fact, even though people didn't talk about it, there are lots of mixed people. That is, people of indigenous heritage, along with West African heritage, and along with British and European heritage. And then, in fact, in places like Eastern North Carolina, since at least the 16th century, or at least the 17th century, people have been mixing. It wasn't talked about, it became illegal later, but these laws just show that people were forming what became what we call Americans. You know, we are mongrels, and mostly we're proud of this. We're not a single race, we actually combine peoples from all over the world. Well, it began not at Ellis Island, not in 1900. It began much, much earlier. You'll see here to the top right, there's the Lumbee, the largest Native American tribe east of the Mississippi. They live primarily in southeastern North Carolina. There at the bottom, you'll see two Lumbee that I spoke with, who told me incredible stories about Virginia Dare, because Virginia Dare was rumored to have lived among them in the 16th century. And they still have these stories of the Lost Colony, which is quite fascinating. And we can talk about that maybe more in the question and answer session. And then to the left, you'll see Marilyn Berry Morrison, who is the chief of the Roanoke Hatteras tribe. Now, she was considered growing up a Black woman. She was African American. But then she discovered there were all of these traditions in her background that were not quite African American. The way they cooked, the spices they used, some of the way they fished and hunted was very much like the Algonquin peoples today up in Canada. So there's clearly remnants of this mixing that we see even now in parts of Eastern North Carolina. So, and this is just a quick note, got to bring Thomas Jefferson into this as a Virginian. Even he noted that the Indians had mixed with the African Americans, with escaped slaves primarily. And Jefferson says, well, they've lost their language and there are only a few of them left. Well, I'm afraid Mr. Jefferson was wrong, because to the right, you will see the chief of the Mattaponi Indians, who is there greeting Queen Elizabeth II. So the Native Americans in Virginia, of course, are alive and well, but like the white people, they had been mixing for centuries with the blacks as well as the whites, who we all share the continent with. All right, so this is the last piece, and then we can go to Q&A. The legacy of this and the irony is that Virginia Dare emerged as this symbol of whiteness, that the symbol of a lost child, lost white child on an island surrounded by dark savages. You know, you get the picture. But the irony is that if she has descendants, then they would be considered colored, because if the lost colonists moved in with the Native Americans, which we've established is probably true, and then if they in turn mixed with escaped slaves in the swamps, which is clearly true, then the true descendants of the lost colonists would today be considered African Americans. Now, of course, that's a very difficult term. What does it mean? Was Obama black or was he white? You know, his mother was white, his father was black. So a lot of this is about our own ideas about what race is and our confusion about how to categorize people. But you know, people are more complicated. And the irony again is that Virginia Dare today, if you're looking for a descendant, don't look for her in a white community. Look for her in an African American community or an indigenous community. And this is just a final image of John White's, one of his magnificent drawings of the corn dance, green corn dance that he witnessed near Roanoke Island. And I think it gets across this idea that what seems to be the strength of this country is the mixing of peoples that bring together new ideas, new inventions, new foods, new ways of living. And what we've, I think, forgotten is that the Lost Colony is really where it all began. And that even if we don't know exactly what happened to them, we know that that these lost English settlers or abandoned English settlers almost certainly became Native American. And then in turn, they mixed with the African Americans. So I think it's a way of seeing our history as rather than as a mystery, than as a kind of a triumph of the coming together of these three very different groups to create a very unique people. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Peggy, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right. Here's one question that I think is really interesting. Can you say something about the legacy of the Virginia Dare mythology compared to what's going on now this year in terms of white supremacy, monuments, and so forth?
Well, that's a big question. Well, I was raised with the story of Virginia Dare as the first English child born in the New World. And I think in a way she's a mirror. I think the Virginia Dare is a mirror for who we are and what we want to be. So feminists, for example, often look at Virginia Dare as this powerful symbol of a woman who made it on her own in the forest without other men trying to help her out. That's one way of looking at her. Another way of looking at her is that she was this lost white girl surrounded by dark savages, and that's what's happening to this country. And we need to be afraid of these dark savages, meaning people of color. You know, this is very pervasive idea that goes back centuries and centuries in this country. And another way of looking at her is that she was simply used for advertising, which is a great American tradition, to take some kind of symbol, whether it's the Statue of Liberty or Pocahontas, and commercialize her. So I think Virginia Dare gives us a mirror of who we are and who we want to be. And I think it's up to each of us to consider how we see Virginia Dare. And in doing that, we could understand more who we are and what kind of country we want to be.
Okay, here's another one. This relates to DNA testing. Do you know if there's been DNA testing done on Lost Colony descendants of lost colony relatives in England and local Native Americans to try to determine this connection between the colonists and the local indigenous people.
Well, this is a great question because, as you all know, DNA and ancient DNA is, this powerful new tool we have to understand the past. But in this case, so far, it hasn't helped. I'll tell you why. First of all, to answer the question, we don't know who the descendants of the lost colony are. Even in England, we've been unable to trace with any kind of certainty who the descendants of John White and the other 115 colonists are. And without that, we don't know who to test. So that's one thing. So you've got to have a descendant so you know what their DNA looks like. And then you also need something else. You've got to have a skeleton from somewhere around eastern North Carolina that you could identify as a lost colonist. How do you do that? Well, maybe if we get lucky, we'll come across a grave of a woman with her head facing east that has Elizabethan goods around her. That would mean probably lost colonists because there were not a lot of women that came. So if it's a man, it could be a shipwreck, it could be a later expedition, it could be many things. But a woman would really narrow it down. And facing east, because that's the way Christians buried themselves. But the hard thing about this is twofold. One, if they indeed became Native Americans, they might not have been buried in the Christian way after they lived with the Native Americans for some time. And number two, these days, it's not okay to dig up Native American graves. That's been done by anthropologists and archaeologists for well over a century, and now it's considered to be not much better than digging up anyone's grandmother in a graveyard. So it's no longer as easy to find those kinds of graves and to examine them. So for these reasons, DNA at this point remains off the table. It's not solved the mystery, and it'll take a lot more research in order for it to be successful in doing so.
We seem to think that DNA is the magic potion today, but I can see the problem.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about these? In your Behind the Myth slide, you talked about legends of Virginia Dare and stories about her among the current indigenous people.
Sure. I mean, the most famous story that I heard as a child was that, as I mentioned, that the Lumbee had taken in the lost colonists. Now, I looked into this, and when I started to do the research, it got really interesting because there's no mention of this in any of the literature until after the Civil War. So, well, but maybe it's an oral tradition. On the other hand, the colonists were living a couple hundred miles away. It's quite a long distance to get from Hatteras Island to the swamps of southeastern North Carolina. Why would they go there? It's not clear. And the bigger question, it turned out to be, well, what's the real evidence here? There's no clear evidence before the 1870s that the colonists had shown up in what's called the Lumbee area now. And I discovered that it became a story when the Lumbee wanted to be made an Indian tribe and to be considered something other than Black. Because at that point, schools were being built for the first time for the freed slaves. But these schools were underfunded, they were very poor, and the Lumbee, as a people, didn't want to have to send their children to those schools. They wanted to have their own schools. So a deal was cut, a political deal was cut in Raleigh, where the legislature agreed to allow the Lumbee to have their own schools and to be considered Indians rather than Black people. And in return, the Lumbee agreed to vote Democratic because the Democrats in that era were the white supremacists. The Democrats were the party of the whites, whereas the Republicans, remember, it was the party of Lincoln. They were the ones who were supported primarily by African Americans and indigenous people. So it turned out that this whole story was really almost certainly a political deal as opposed to oral history that can really shed light on what happened to the colonists. Again, here's the lost colony telling us more about a later time than it tells us about Elizabethan times.
Okay, and you mentioned the hidden fort on the white map and a little bit about archaeological work. Are they still working on that?
Well, the good news is that that site, which was nearly developed, has been protected. The state of North Carolina now has turned it into a park. It is protected, but there's been some limited digging there in the past couple of years. But at this point, they haven't done anything really extensive enough to provide incontrovertible evidence that the lost colonists went there. They have not actually found the fort, for example, nor have they found pottery or other artifacts that everyone agrees are Elizabethan in nature. So I'm hoping that as time goes by, they can raise the money to do this. You know, archaeology is expensive. It requires having a team out there digging, and the digging is only part of it. Then you have to catalog and organize the artifacts, and then you have to analyze them, and then you have to publish what you found. So it requires a lot of intellectual effort as well as financial resources. And I know that that group, the First Colony Foundation, would love some donations. I also know that on Hatteras Island, there are some tentative plans to resume excavations at the site, Cape Creek, that I was talking about earlier. We're hoping that also they will be publishing what they've already dug. And at that point, we'll have more information. So you're going to see more and more clues maybe dribbling in the next few years.
That's exciting that there's still more to be found. What about ground radar? Have they done anything with that?
Yes, the problem with ground penetrating radar, what's nice about it is that you can go over a piece of land and without digging, you can make out, say, where there's a ditch or where there was a building. But unfortunately, the landscape on the Outer Banks is not really conducive to that. It's either sandy or it's got lots of roots, lots of tree roots. And there's been so much erosion, and there was probably so little in terms of major architecture that was ever built, that it's going to be very difficult to use GPR in order to nail that down. But there may be new techniques that are going to come into play. I know they were using a particular kind of dating on Roanoke Island to see if they could locate the site of the fort. Because remember, we don't know where the lost colonists left. We don't have the fort and the town, the city of Raleigh that John White describes. We don't know where that was. All we have is a little piece of that workshop I mentioned from 1585. But we don't know if that was actually in town. It probably was on the outskirts of town because it had furnaces. It was kind of a messy, polluting piece of industry. So one of the real mysteries is, where did they leave from, much less where did they go?
Wow. Here's a question relating to your book. In your book, you talk about Virginia Dare wine from Francis Ford Coppola. Do you have any idea why he picked that name?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, and so I called him up and I asked him. It took a little while, but I got through to him. And I said, so what gives? I mean, you're of Italian heritage, and you've just bought this wine that is named for this figure from the Lost Colony. What's the connection? And he told me this great story. He said, well, yeah, we're Italian, and we knew about this wine because I would see the advertisements. And I was so entranced by this beautiful girl with blue eyes and blonde hair. I fell in love with her, and I just loved this wine as a child. I said, well, did you drink it at home? He said, oh, no, it's a terrible wine. We were Italian. We drank good wine. So he remembered this. And then when the Virginia Dare wine, when the name came up, he spotted it and snapped it up so that he could make his own winery that could revive this tradition. And I actually went out there and gave a talk at the winery, which was really fun. And it's very peculiar because, again, Virginia Dare for him was not a symbol of white supremacy. He was horrified when I said that to him. He said, no, for me, she's just a symbol of innocence and beauty and the origin of this country. She's a historical figure, and he wanted to honor her. So again, we have all these different people who look at her and they see something different.
So he doesn't use Scuppernong grapes in his wine, you're telling us. That's
Thank
good.
God, no. And from what I've heard, people who are more experienced than me in these spirits, Scuppernong wine, which, by the way, was produced in enormous quantities in Norfolk, Virginia. In fact, the of the old bottle says made in Norfolk. It was a really big industry in Norfolk at the turn of the century. They brought in these grapes from Virginia and the Outer Banks, and they made this wine, which today I'm told tastes very much like diesel fuel. But at the time, that taste was really, really popular in that kind of late Victorian time. And I was unable to get a whole lot of information about the plant in Norfolk, but it definitely was a large business. And they were trading on the name of Virginia Dare and saying we're getting grapes from the vine on Roanoke Island, the famous vine down there. And they told the story of Virginia Dare being shot in the heart by a jealous lover, and she's turned into a white doe. So there are all of these wonderful mythical stories that were inserted into the advertising and helped to create a pretty big business in Norfolk.
Wow. Here's one last question. I'm talking about artifacts. If there have been any artifacts discovered that pertain to the possible travel of some of the lost colonists up to the Norfolk area. There was an archaeological dig at the corner of Cedar Road and Battlefield Boulevard in Chesapeake a few years ago. Do you know anything about the result of that dig or any other artifacts pertaining to the colonists' travel to the Norfolk area?
No, I would love to know more about that dig. So if the viewer would maybe send a contact piece, I'd love to talk to them about it. I've not heard of that. No, there's been lots of talk by historians, very famous historians, a British historian who wrote a lot about the Lost Colony back in the 50s and 60s, and he was really hot on this idea. It makes sense in a way because they did eventually want to move to the Chesapeake, it's clear, but we have no evidence. And the one piece of evidence that's often used is that the Jamestown people ran across a boy who had blonde hair. Now, I looked into that story because it was very compelling. It's like, okay, he's somebody blonde, he was light colored. What's he doing around Jamestown in 1607? Well, when I looked in the literature, it turns out that Native Americans have a far higher incidence of albinism than do white people and or African Americans. So almost certainly this person that was run into was actually somebody who actually was a friend of Walter Raleigh, who was on the Jamestown expedition. It turns out that almost certainly this was an albino rather than somebody whose genes have been passed down. So we don't have any physical evidence, and it's going to be very hard, given the development around Norfolk in the past couple hundred years. It's a big needle in the haystack. The advantage of places like Site X and Hatteras is that there's been more limited development, and it's still a place you can dig and maybe find stuff. I mean, it would be great to find the original village that I mentioned that's located in the Norfolk area. But as far as I know, that's still unknown. The location of that is unknown. If we can't find that, it's going to be very hard to find European goods from Elizabethan times.
Well, I hope you'll keep us posted on any future finds, and we'll put it on our website because this is fascinating.
Well, this story is going to continue. It's certainly not over. I mean, my book is really gives all the latest of the archaeological evidence, but I think there will be more to come.
Wow, that's great. Have you had any people respond to you from your from reading your book with more clues?
More clues. Certainly, there are going to be more digs that are happening in the next year or two. And I've no doubt that there will be quite a bit of new evidence coming from these papers that are hopefully going to be published soon. The thing about archaeology is you dig, and it takes years and years to do the analysis and to really get the new information out there. And scientists have to debate it. Is this right? Is this wrong? Did you do it right? Did you not do it right? So it's not like we're going to find the answer tomorrow. It's going to be a series of clues. This is a murder mystery. And it's a murder mystery that we likely will never completely solve. But we can come up with really, really good ideas of what happened. I think it goes without saying the lost colonists certainly decided to throw in their lot with Native Americans because they wanted to eat.
Sure. Well, this was great. So we will look forward to an update anytime now. And thank you so much for being with us tonight, Andrew. It was just so interesting and a lot of food for thought. I will invite all of our listeners, viewers, to our program next month, the second Wednesday in August, which is August 11th. Our presenter will be Ben Trask, and he will be talking about the 1855 yellow fever epidemic in Norfolk. And not only the epidemic, but some of the political repercussions from that time. That's always a side effect. So I hope you'll join us next month. This evening's program has been recorded and it will be available on our website real soon, within the next few days, probably. Andrew, thank you again. And thanks to everyone who attended. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Have a good rest of your evening. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.